Well, 2 weeks ago, we kicked off a sermon series entitled Entrusted. And with that series, we've been focusing on the fact that each and every one of us have been called to be stewards of all of God's good and perfect gifts that He has been blessing us with throughout our lives. Now, in the Bible, a steward is a person who cares for or manages the property or possessions that have been entrusted to them by the actual owner. And in doing so, it's expected that stewards are to manage the property and possessions of the owner in the way they expect or the way they had anticipated or desired. And in Psalm chapter 24, verses 1 and 2, the Bible makes it abundantly clear that everything belongs to God. There in Psalm 24, David writes these words. He writes, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it." Like it doesn't leave much room for anything that might belong to us. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. But not only that, it says the world and all who live in it. So David's like, hey, everything is God's. And then he gives us the reason why. For he founded it upon the seas and established it on the waters. And this is a reference, this reference, for he founded it upon the seas and established it upon the waters. This is a reference back to Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, when the Bible says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and empty, and the darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And so David takes us back and like, hey, everything belongs to God, everyone belongs to God, because in the beginning, when there was just darkness and the surface of the water here, God spoke everything into being. And if you continue reading in Genesis chapter 1, you're going to, day after day, God's bringing something else, speaking something else into existence, right? And so we know the creation story. And so David just reflects on that like, hey, everything and everyone belongs to God. It's as simple as that. And so looking at that, recognizing that everything and every one of us belong to God, understanding that God has given us things. He's gifted us with things. And He's given us, finances. He's given us property. He's given us various possessions. He's given us time. He's given us relationships. He's given us jobs. Like He's given us every good and perfect gift, James says, comes down from the Father of heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. Like God has been giving, continues to give, and will continue in the future to give to us. The Bible talks about how like Jesus is not only the creator of the world, but He's the sustainer of it too. And so it's like in every way, and from every perspective, like God owns it all and has given it to us for us to use, but we know that we exist not for our own purposes, we exist for the purpose of God. And we exist to bring Him honor and to bring Him glory. And so simply put, David's just stating the fact that since everything belongs to God, we are functioning in our lives as stewards of all that God owns, and we are meant to use it for His purposes and for His glory. Now, last week, our primary focus was the fact that if we're like most people, we probably need to increase our generosity. And we looked at 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 through 15. And as we worked our way through that passage, like three things came to the surface. First of all, Paul talks about the Macedonian example. If you remember back, or you can look back there if you weren't here last week, he gives an example of the Macedonians and their generosity. And not in like great times. He's like, they were an example of generously living in the midst of severe trials and during a time of great poverty in their lives. And they still were able to be generous with how they gave. Secondly, he challenged the Corinthians and like, hey, you guys started strong, finished strong. Like this was your idea. Giving this gift to the Christians in Jerusalem who are suffering, who have nothing, was your idea. You started strong, and you're to be commended for that, but finish strong. And then the last thing he shared was the ultimate result of living generously, and that was the ability to honor God with our lives. And so this week we're going to continue in 2 Corinthians, and we're going to be looking at 2 Corinthians 9, verses 6 through 11. So if you have your Bibles, you can turn there, and we're going to just look at a foundational idea, okay? And that is, like last week's was, we need to increase our generosity. This week's focus is we need to recognize our prosperity. All right, and so I know we say that, or I say that, and you might be thinking, well, you're talking to someone else because I don't feel very prosperous. And so I just want us to be on the same page, like with what I'm talking about here. And so to do that, we have to readjust our lens, because oftentimes we think about this in the context of like people we see. Like maybe people we see on social media, or maybe people we see in our workplace or in our schools, people that we see in our neighborhoods maybe. Maybe people that we see, families that we see as we drive through town. Like we measure our prosperity based on what we see around us. That's how we do it. That's how everyone does it. All right? But from a more kind of holistic view, I wanted to walk through some statistics that I came across this week. So we have a slide here of the world, right? The first one, yeah. So that's the world. Probably not 100% accurate, but you get the idea. That's the world there. When it comes to prosperity, when it comes to like wealth distribution around the world, it is somewhat unequal. The next slide is the world, and that's 60% of the world. And if you read it, 60% of the world lives on less than $900 a year. All right? So if you only make $900 a year, you fit into the vast majority of people in the world, right? 60% of the world lives on $900 or less a year. There's, I guess, the middle class, I guess, would be the next group, the 30%. 30% of the world, it says, lives on less than $9,000 a year, all right? So that's now 90% of the world. And even if we just use the second number, lives on less than $9,000 a year. So the last group, the top 10% of wealth in the world, is a group that encompasses people that make $9,000 a year and more, right? And so that's like the upper class, the wealthiest people in the world, the wealthiest 10% of the people in the world, $9,000 a year or more. So my question is, like, where do you fall on this wealth distribution, this wealth breakdown? Like, are you like are you a poor person, the 60%? Are you a middle class person? Are you in the upper class 9? And if I had to guess, probably all of us would fit in the top 10%, right? Well, you don't have to raise your hand, but if you live in the United States, you probably live in the top 10%. Now, I talk about this because I know how we look. I know how we feel. I know that, if you live paycheck to paycheck and you feel like things are tight all the time and like money's a struggle, I get that. I've been there, right? Several years ago, I had this opportunity to lead a missions trip. I lead a missions trip to Mzumbe, KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. All right? And so it was a great trip. The group was made up of several elders of the church and then several students as well. And so we were going to South Africa to do some construction projects and to do VBS. And so we got on the plane. We flew however many hours it was from I think Baltimore down to Johannesburg, and we flew into Johannesburg. Everyone's looking out the window, and honestly, it looked like we were flying to any major city in the United States. It looked basically the same. And then we had a connecting flight from Johannesburg to Durban, South Africa, and we flew there. And once again, we kind of flew in a smaller town, but still looked like a very modern place. Then we got in vans, and we went from Durban to KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. And when we were going from Durban, it was like a city environment, and then we got into a more suburban environment, and then we made our way into a rural environment. And the roads went from paved roads to gravel roads to dirt roads to footpaths. And we're driving there, and we drive into this community, and we see a large group of people around this object. And it took me a while to figure out what it was, and then I realized it was the well that everyone had to go to get their drinking water. The bad thing for them was they lived on kind of a hill, I guess. I wouldn't say a mountain, but a hill. And they were at the top of it, and the water was at the bottom of it. And so every day, if they wanted to cook or wash, they would have to go to the well and fill up 5-gallon buckets. And you would see these ladies, it was always ladies, I didn't see any men doing it, carrying these 5-gallon buckets of water on their head. And usually they had a child or two in their arms. And so they're walking and balancing these, I don't know how much they weighed. Someone probably could do the math for me, how much 5 gallons of water on their heads sloshing around, walking uphill with these babies. I don't want to paint too bad of a picture, but if they wanted to cook, you'd also see these ladies carrying, I don't know where the men were, but it was all ladies doing all the hard work, I will tell you that, carrying these big bundles of sticks on their heads as well. Once again, they had their kids with them, and their kids would be carrying sticks on their heads as well, and that's what they cooked with. And so we made our way past like the well, and we drove up the hill to where the community was, and we drove into a community, and it was all homes that were called roundavels. And basically what they were mud homes, all right? They just had like clay there. They built their houses from the clay, just the ground. They pack the clay together, wet it, make these bricks, and they would make these roundavels, thatched roofs. Typically only one opening, and that is the door, and they would have some sort of cloth. It's usually a scrap of something, and then their floors were dirt. One room, and then they didn't even have outhouses. They would just go in the woods somewhere or in the brush and use the restroom there. That was how they lived. There was a Christian school. Missionaries had built a school there so that students could be educated. They provided uniforms that the same clothes they would wear year after year until they just didn't fit anymore. So very rarely did someone have clothes that fit. You know, if they were growing, they were usually too short. If they were younger, they were usually too big. No one had shoes. But one thing that they all had was a smile on their face. And so we did our projects. We did some work at the school. One of our favorite thing was we were digging a giant outhouse, and so it was just all we had to do was just dig the deepest hole, biggest hole that we could do, and that's like took no brains and just a bunch of bronze, and we were perfect for that job. Just throw us in there and start digging, and we did that for like 2 weeks. We got to do the VBS at the school, and students would come, and they were just amazed at having crayons. Like, there was actually some fights. Some of the teenagers were fighting, literally, fist, because at the end of the week, we were like, hey, you guys can take the crayons home. And it was they were like so excited about having the opportunity to have a couple of crayons to take home that they were getting in fights about it. And so we figured that wasn't probably the best Christian example that we could set, and so we had to figure out a way that everyone realized that you're going to get some. It's all right. You're going to get some. We have enough for everyone. One of the things that surprised me, though, that I was blown away by it. I wasn't prepared for it at all. Was every day after a VBS, the students would sit down, or their volunteers would sit down with our group of volunteers and students, and just like small groups everywhere, and they were learning English as part of their studies. Instead of speaking Zulu, they would try to teach us Zulu, and they would want to learn English from us, and so it was kind of a fun thing. But I was walking through the area where like there was several groups talking, and I just came across one where I heard one of the students from my group explaining to these South African students how poor he was. And at first I was like, what are you talking about? Like read the room. Like these kids they've been wearing the same clothes like all week, probably only have two sets of clothes anyway, no shoes on their feet, no electricity, no running water, burning sticks for heat to cook on, having to walk to the bottom of the hill to get water to bring back to their family, and you're telling them how poor you are. And they had questions too. They were like, do you guys have a car? He was like, yeah, we have 2 cars, but they're really not that good. I mean, And he's talking about his 2-story house and running water and electricity and cabinets full of food. And they're just like, they're like, what are you talking about? How can you think that you're poor in those circumstances? But you know what? There are times where I felt that way. I look at the people around me and I see like the kind of cars they're driving or the house they're living in or vacations are going on. And I'm like, well, and we can't afford that. We can't do that. So I'm lacking something. Poverty is a perspective. If you talk to those South African kids, man, they were full of joy because they were grateful for what they had. And so I want us foundationally, before we get to anything that Paul is writing about, I just want to understand the prosperity we have and the freedoms we have as American Christians. And we have been blessed by God with so much. And one of the things that Paul wants us to understand is with great blessing comes great responsibility as well. And so this morning, as we work our way through 2 Corinthians 9, 6 through 11, I believe Paul shares 4 principles of giving. In light, and this is very important, 4 principles of giving in light of how we've already been blessed. All right, I understand that. This is kind of in response to God. Because some people look at the passage we're going to look at, and they use it as a way to say, hey, if you give, God's going to give you more. That's a backwards view of what is being talked about here. What's being talked about here is God has already blessed us. Out of his blessing, we need to bless other people. And you know what? Primarily, and I'll probably say this again later on, but I want to make sure I say it. Primarily, this is being written about like this financial gift that we talked about last week in 2 Corinthians 8. This offering that was taken up by the Macedonian Christians and the Corinthian Christians and the Christians around the Mediterranean Sea to be sent back to Jerusalem to help the Jewish Christians there who were suffering persecution. And recognizing that the blessing that they have received because of what started in Jerusalem, and now they have this opportunity to minister to them and to help them. And it's primarily about a financial gift, a financial offering, but the principles apply to all aspects of our lives. And what we're going to look at, like everything, we learned from David, everything and everyone belongs to God. And so as we look at these principles of giving, I want us to apply it not only to our finances, but to our time and to our energy and to our talents. I want to apply it to all of who we are because we are stewards of all those things. And so the first principle I want to look at in this passage is generous sowing results in generous reaping. All right? So let me just read the passage. 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 6 tells us this. Remember this, whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows generously will also reap generously. And now before we start talking about this passage, I want to address a misconception, and I mentioned it already in general, but I believe that some people seem to teach that if you give generously of your money to God, they teach that God's going to multiply that and he's going to give it back to you exponentially. Like he's going to give back to you way more money if you do that. I don't think this is meant to be some sort of spiritual get-rich-quick scheme or some spiritual, God-ordained investment strategy. This isn't meant to be that. Personally, I don't think God's primary concern is the growth of our wealth. I don't think that's not his primary concern. He's not interested in growing our kingdom or what we see as our kingdom here on this earth. His primary concern is the growth of his kingdom. And as we look at the Christians in chapter 8 and here in chapter 9, what we're going to see is the fruit that they're looking for isn't financial growth for themselves. The fruit that they're looking for is the impact their gift can have on others. And so as we look at this principle here, like those who sow sparingly will also reap sparingly. Those who sow generously will also reap generously. He's like, hey, if you're a generous giver, then you're going to have a tremendous impact. If you live close-fisted and you're not willing to give of yourself, or specifically in this case, you're not willing to give of your money, then your impact is going to be very small, insignificant. And as we read 2 Corinthians, it seems like the Corinthian Christians, definitely the Macedonian Christians, it seems like everyone desired that. Like the reason they're giving is because they want to have this huge impact on the people they are giving of themselves for. If God were to grow our personal treasures or our personal kingdoms, I think that would be counterproductive oftentimes. And I say that because I've seen it in so many times, and I even see in the Bible where Jesus addressed it, like it's difficult for the rich person to enter the kingdom of God, because what happens is they take their eyes off God and his purpose, and they begin to focus on their kingdom, and how do I protect that? How do I grow this? And that becomes their heart's desires. And Jesus talked about, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And you can't love both God and money. Like so much is said, and we don't talk about money that often, and to my discredit, I guess, because Jesus has a lot to say about it, because materialism can go so rampant in people's hearts, and they don't even recognize it. Like they can worship their retirement program or their bank account, or they can worship their car or their house or their clothes. They can worship various aspects of their material possessions and not even know it, and they focus on it to the detriment of their relationship with God. And so sometimes I think, like, when people preach this message of, hey, if you give to God, he's going to give you way more than you can handle, that's not the fruit that he's looking for in this harvest. All right? The fruit that he's looking for is our opportunity to have an impact on other people. And we're going to see that evidenced as we move through the text. And so the first principle is generously sowing results in generous reaping. We're talking specifically about our impact. Like, we have this opportunity by how we live to have a tremendous impact. And it only makes sense. Like, you think about a relationship with a coworker or a friend or a family member. If you invest of yourself, if you invest your time and your energy and your talents and your money, and you invest yourself completely in trying to help them move forward in their faith, you're going to have a bigger impact than if you just begrudgingly give your time or begrudgingly give your effort to them, right? Like, the more we give, the more of an impact that we can have. And this is what Paul is talking about in verse 6. If we move forward, the second principle I see in this text is generous giving is initiated by a cheerful and generous heart. Okay, and we see that in this very next passage in verse 7. It says, each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And so I mentioned this last week, so I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but I think we have to mention it again. This is such a foreign concept to the Jewish Christians that were listening to Paul, or who were reading Paul's letter here. In the Old Covenant, everyone was expected to give at least 10% of everything they had, of their possessions, of their finances, to God. 10% was what the tithe was, and then various offerings on top of that. And so Paul, he's bringing something up, and he's saying offerings shouldn't be given out of obligation or by compulsion. Each one is to decide in their hearts what they are to give. And if we jump back to verse 8, it's not, or not verse 8, jump back to chapter 8, it's not based on what they don't have, but what they do have. And he's like, hey, no longer, like, our giving should be, whether it's our time or money or whatever, our giving should be an act of worship. And you're not worshiping anyone when you're acting in obligation. We understand this idea when it, like, as a parent, you understand, like, what you want for your kids. And if our kids truly want to honor us, they don't do things out of obligation. They do things out of love. Like, there's a huge difference. You ask, because no one likes to clean the litter box, right? Not too many people. You try to check them, hey, just go get all the little treasures out of the litter box. And it works maybe when they're little, but after that, they realize they stink and no one wants to touch them. But we do have a little scoop, so you don't actually touch them. You guys are killing me today. So the same thing can happen in two different kids, right? One kid can be in like, oh man, if I don't do this, I'm going to be in trouble, and so I'm just going to do it. I hate doing this, and grumble the whole time and just be mad and pout, and they scoop it out and they throw it in there and they scatter litter all the way to the trash can and they throw it outside in the trash can, right? And that's one way. The job is done. Is that really honoring parents? Obviously, we would say no. But if a child's like, you know what? I live in this house. They've asked me to do this. I love my parents. I don't really like doing this job, but I'm going to do it, and I'm going to do it cheerfully. They don't say this, but they can act it out. They can show it with their actions, and they go do it, and they kind of have a smile on their face, and they're like, hey, Mom, Dad, I did it, and we give them a big hug and say, thank you. You did such a good job. You can do it tomorrow, too. But that is much more honoring, isn't it? There are ways that we can do things. We can do the same thing, the same action, but there are two different ways. We can do it in a way that's honoring self or honoring the other person. And what Paul is directing us to is like, hey, if we truly want to honor God with our stewardship or with our giving, we need to do it cheerfully and with joy, recognizing it's not our lives aren't about us. Our lives are meant to bring honor and glory to God. Our lives are meant to expand His kingdom, not to expand our own. And so, if our desire is to make an eternal impact, then we need to understand that we shouldn't be doing these things out of obligation, but in a way that brings honor and glory to Him. The next principle I see in this passage is a generous God allows us to be generous givers. And this is so important. You know, a generous God allows us to be generous givers. Listen to what Paul says in verse 8. He says, and God is able to bless you abundantly so that in all things, at all times, having all that you need, you will be abound in every good work. Just think about what Paul's writing there, okay? Because it's so important. He's saying, God blesses us abundantly so that the blessing is already there. Like he's poured blessings into our lives since the day we were born, since before we were born. Like being alive, is a blessing from God. And He continues to bless us each and every day and provide for us each and every day. And He does that so that in all things, at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work. It's like once we have this idea, once we have this understanding that God is just so faithful and blessing, He's taking care of our needs, and we look back through our history, like I'm 52 years old now, and I realize that every day He's provided for me, every day He's taken care of me, every day He's helped meet my needs, and I look forward into the future, and there's uncertainty, but God's been faithful in the past. What would prevent Him from being faithful in the future? And as I come to this understanding in my life, and I understand that He has been good and He's blessed me, and what I have is His already anyway, my response will be, hey, I can be generous because God has been so generous with me. What He describes to me, when I was reading, I was like, what can I use to illustrate this principle? Like, God blesses me so that I can bless others. And the thing that just kept coming to my mind was just breathing. Like, you can't just keep breathing in. Like, when you breathe in, what's the next thing you do? Someone say it, please. Thank you. We breathe in, and then we breathe out, all right? God blesses us so that we can bless others. God blesses us so we can bless others. He gives us time, and we share that time with others. He gives us talents and abilities, and we share that with others. He gives us attention, and we give attention to others. Like, He pours into our lives so we can pour into the lives of others, and it should be as natural as breathing. That's kind of why He says, He blesses you so that you can do these things, and you will abound. Like, it's kind of expected. It's like He gives, we give. He gives, we give. And it just goes on and on like that. If we continue to read in verses 9 through 11, once again, we notice the order of what's going on. He says, as it is written, they have freely scattered their gifts to the poor. Their righteousness endures forever. This is a quote from Psalm 112, verse 9, a song that focuses on how God blesses those who delight in Him and who delight in honoring Him and live according to His will. And then Paul goes on to write this. And once again, notice the sequence of events. He says this, now He who supplies the seed to the sower, it's like, okay, The person who blesses you, like who's pouring these gifts into your lives, he who supplies the seed to the sower and bread for food, will also supply and increase your store of seed and will enlarge the harvest of your righteousness. So once again, I want you to know, I want you to understand like the fruit. He identifies the fruit once again. A harvest of not your wealth, not your kingdom, not your possessions, not your status. That's not the harvest he's looking to increase. The harvest of your righteousness, the harvest of your ability to live in a God-honoring way, live right with God. And so he's like saying, he's going to enlarge the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in every way, and here's our two favorite words again, so that you're going to be enriched, you're going to be blessed in every way so that you can be generous on every occasion. And Paul just continues to say the same thing here, like, hey, there is no magic number now. It's like, how has God blessed you? Has he blessed you financially? Then bless others financially. Has he blessed you with talents and gifts? Then bless others with your talents and gifts. Has he blessed you with time? Bless others with your time. Like, however he's blessed you in whatever way, use those things. Everything belongs to God. He's like, be my stewards. Honor me with what I've blessed you with. The principle here is that God is generous with us so that we can be generous with others. There's one final principle I want to close with this morning, and that is a generous life results in thanksgiving to God. And this is the last part of verse 11, like the second part there. And it says, and through us, your generosity will result in thanksgiving to God. Ultimately, Paul states that as we live generously, others will thank God for how we're living. This is exactly what Jesus talked about in the Sermon on the Mount when he talked about being salt and light. He's like, do your acts of righteousness before men. Like, live in a way that honors God. Your acts of righteousness is giving of yourself and giving of your time and giving of your wealth. It's like actually being the person that God's called you to be. Do your acts of righteousness before men so they may be seen by them and glorify your Father in heaven. Ultimately, that is our goal. We need to understand our life isn't about building our own kingdom. Our life isn't to increase our status or our standing. Our life isn't meant to be trying to become this great person so that others can look up to us. Our life is meant to be living in such a way that we lift up God, and so when they look at us, they see him, and they worship, and they praise, and they're drawn to him. God's primary desire for each and every one of us is for us to help him expand his kingdom, because when that happens, lost people are won. When that happens, the world is changed, our communities are changed, our families are changed. And so I just want to encourage you this morning. The praise team can come up, and I want you to ask, what kind of impact do you want to have